I'm John Law, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the Mazda CX-30. And this model we have on test today is the Pure, the base model, and you can get this bigger, plusher Mazda crossover for about the same price as you can get a mid-spec CX-3. So the question of today's video is, should you be taking the base model CX-30 into account, and is it a good buy? Well, that's what we're going to find out. Now, the CX-30 competes in a very crowded market, not only in general terms, but of course also in just Mazda terms. You've got the CX-3, this car, and the MX-30 all vying for a similar position in the Australian market. So for $33,990, what does this CX-30 Pure bring to the table? Well, for a start, it looks pretty much the same as the rest of the CX-30 range, including the premium Astina. Of course, that is save for the small 16-inch alloy wheels, though we rather like those, and I rather like the styling of the CX-30. Of course, that's subjective, and there are guys at the Chasing Cars office who think this is actually the worst looking Mazda on sale. I don't think so. I think it's got really nice detail, but of course it's all subjective. So let me know what you think in the comment section below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, we'd love it if you could hit subscribe to Chasing Cars. Now, what we're going to do is dive inside the CX-30 and see how it's holding up. So while the CX-30 does look really good outside, it's inside where I think it's at its most convincing. Now, you may have caught a video where Editor Baker compared the new CX-30 when it first came out in Astina trim with a bunch of premium small SUVs, and you'll be aware that it did really rather well. And most of those benefits carry over to this Pure entry-level grade, which is a really good thing. And so that means you have a really nice design. It's lovely in here. I think it looks very schmick and slick and a really nice holistic piece of design. You've also got some really nice touches, including soft touch all up on the dashboard and in front of you here with this sort of Maztexy stuff, which just adds a little bit of quality to it. You've also got a digital driver's display, which Mazda has thankfully integrated a digital speedo into now after our complaints. So it's good to hear that they're listening to us. You also get a head-up display in this base model CX-30, which is really good to see as well, because it means you can keep your eyes on the road at all times, traffic sign recognition, and all that good stuff. Now, there are a couple of detractors from the CX-30 base model though, and that is the real clanger, the plastic steering wheel. In all other respects, this steering wheel is fantastic. It's the right size, it's the right diameter, and when it's wrapped in leather, in other grades of CX-30, it is as close to perfect as a small SUV steering wheel comes. But in plastic, it's just not good enough in my opinion, and that means I would have to spend the extra $3,000 to get the Evolve, which then comes with a whole bunch more kit. The other thing about this car, which may be good and may be bad for certain people, personally, generally speaking, I really rather like cloth seats. Black cloth is nice, stays cool in the Australian sun. However, the problem with cloth seats is that if you want to get out your custard tart and eat it on the go, it's really difficult to clean up. And you'll know if you have kids, then something like Maztex, the vinyl that Mazda offers, or leather in the upgrades may be a better choice. What else have we got going on? Well, we've got the updated infotainment system in the CX-30, so you get an 8.8-inch widescreen. It's not a touchscreen, you have to control it through this rotary dial down here, though it works really rather nicely. Of course, although Tom and I often talk about how nice it is to have a rotary dial, sometimes you do just want to use a touchscreen, especially when you're interfacing with smartphone mirroring, which this car has via a cable, so Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. But really, this system does work very well, and it works nicely with Mazda's own infotainment system, which I think has quite good graphics. But you can let me know what you think in the comment section down below. As for storage, the Mazda is pretty well equipped. You've got this really nice center bin that is more than big enough for a custard tart and your wallet and other things like that. You've also got two cup holders ahead of the shifter here, which are of a good size and a good size for a coffee cup. The only issue is that a taller bottle does rattle around and contact with plastic, which can be a bit annoying, so a shorter bottle is probably advisable, but you can always take that bottle and put it in the reasonably sized door bins to get that out of the way. There's also a tray up here for your phone and your wallet, and no wireless charging, but that's fine on a base model. You've also only got one USB port up here, and then a further one in there, and a 12-volt socket. So overall, practicality isn't bad, but this car isn't as good as, say, something like a Skoda Karoq. But hey, the design in here really does make the CX-30 feel very schmick indeed. So to the back seats of the CX-30, and this really is one of the main reasons you'd buy this over the CX-3 because you get a lot more space back here. I say a lot, actually, a lot's maybe overselling it, but you do get space enough that me at 6'2" is actually quite comfortable behind my own driving position. I've got a decent amount of headroom. You wouldn't want to be much taller than me, but you know, that's pretty normal for a back seat. My knees are touching the seat in front of me, but it's not a big deal. It's quite nice and soft fabric, so it's not a real, you know, annoying thing, and I don't feel too cramped back here. And then toe room is really good as well, so you can slide your feet right underneath. The bench in here also feels a little bit more ergonomically designed than the CX-3. It doesn't feel quite so much like an afterthought, so I actually have a nice position with a good little bit of support for my back and for my under thighs. So yeah, all in all, pretty good. There are some issues though. Hard touch materials in the back, though you do get soft touch materials in the front. Again, that's kind of par for the course anyway. You do get a soft armrest too, and a good little bottle holder next to me there. However, this Pure misses out on ventilation. You don't get any air vents or any USB ports back here, which is a real shame. Now, moving up to the Evolve gets you the air vents, and that's another reason to go and spend a little bit more money to get the slightly nicer version of the CX-30. At least in my book, I think that extra $3,000 is going to be worth it in the long run in terms of your enjoyment of the vehicle. The other thing this car misses out on that the CX-3 gets is a center armrest. There's no flip down center armrest. The CX-3 has one, and that means you are limited to just 2 places to store your cups in the outside doors, which is a bit of an odd thing. But the CX-30 hits back with ISOFIX ports on both of the outboard seats and pretty good vision over the front seats, so not too bad back here. One thing I briefly forgot to mention in the back seat, and you can see here, is just how close Mazda got to making the windows go all the way down. They don't quite, the rear windows still sit a little bit proud, but you know, I guess that's all packaging. But what about the rear of the CX-30? Firstly, I think it looks really great. Much like the Mazda 3 hatchback, it's got really lovely LED taillights, which I think really set the rest of this car off. It is a little visually heavy, and there is a bit of black plastic, so you can let me know what you think of that sort of stuff in the comments section down below. But let's pop that boot, where we find 430 litres of space in the front-wheel drive CX-3. If you go for the all-wheel drive model, you'll only get 422 litres of space, which is a bit strange, but it is enough space to fit the chasing car's big suitcase and the carry-on luggage as well. And in terms of shape and size, the boot is pretty practical. However, it misses out on the luxuries that you get in a European car, such as nets and hooks that are really any use. So yeah, one of the detractors from the CX-30 there. And under the boot floor, we do have a space saver spare tire. So nothing particularly to write home about in the boot of the CX-30, but it's a practical enough space for daily shopping or a little weekend away. So let's see how the CX-30 drives out on the road. So out on the road in the Mazda CX-30, and first things first, it's really rather nice. Mazda's done a great job, as they did in the CX-3 and the CX-5, of making this small SUV drive really rather nicely, and it's quite well suited to Australian conditions. But there are a couple of caveats with spec choice that you've got to be wary of in the CX-30 to get the most out of your experience. So in this Pure, there's one option, and that is that you get a 2-litre naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engine, the same found in the Mazda 3, which makes 114 kilowatts and 200 newton meters of torque bang on. Now those outputs are decent enough for a 2-litre engine, but there's a lot more cars out there that have more power from a 2-litre motor, and with this car's weight, 1,442 kilograms if you're wondering, with the 6-speed auto, it feels pretty sluggish. Now this outputs are sent to the front wheels, and you wouldn't need to send them to all 4 wheels because you can't really spin the tyres ever with this combination. And 0 to 100 time is about 10.2 seconds, so it's not the nippiest of the small SUVs out there, and it certainly feels lacking in terms of mid-range punch when compared to competitors like the Volkswagen T-Cross and T-Roc and Skoda Karoq with their turbocharged 1.5-litre engines that just add a little bit more punch to the drive. But there's something to be said about the reliability and the simplicity of a 2-litre 4-cylinder, so you can let me know what your preferences are down below. You can also get other engines, which I would probably recommend doing. So the 2.5-litre Skyactiv G engine is a really good option. That sees outputs up to 139 kilowatts of power and 252 newton meters of torque, and that is much handier in terms of motivating the CX-3 and sees the 0 to 100 times drop by a fair bit, but that is only available with all-wheel drive and only available on the range-topping grades of Touring and Astina. So definitely a lot to consider in the CX-30 range. There are quite a few options. You can also obviously get the X20, the Skyactiv X, which gets a little bit more power than this 2-litre engine, but not quite quite as much power as the 2.5 litre engine, and in theory gets better fuel consumption. So Tom's got a full test on that car as well, but that's a lot more expensive than this car. And I think a CX-30 in this spec with this engine really represents most of what's going to be on the road, and of course the G25 as well. As I said, the G25 just feels like it adds a little bit more verve to the way this car goes down the road, though that's nothing to do with the transmission, because the 6-speed manual feels pretty good. It's pretty slick to shift, certainly feels all right. It doesn't leave you feeling like you need more ratios to play with. Instead, it just gets out of your way. Moving up to the Evolve does get you paddles, but let's talk about how much this CX-30 costs to run. Now we've talked about what the CX-30's engine is like to drive, we've got to talk about how much it's going to cost you to run. And thankfully, it's a fairly simple, naturally aspirated motor. So in theory, it should be fairly hassle-free. So Mazda backs this car with a 5-year unlimited kilometre warranty, as it does with all of its products, and you also get cap price servicing for the first 5 years, and it totals $2,002, including everything like air filters and brake fluid changes as well. Now that also extends for a further 16 years, so you can always calculate how much your Mazda is going to cost to service, which is a really nice little touch. As for fuel consumption, Mazda claims 6.5 litres per 100 Ks for this 2-litre connected to the 6-speed auto, but in the real world we returned 8.5 litres per 100 Ks, which shows how heavy the CX-30 is. Now let's talk about insurance. So over the last 12 months, the median budget direct customer paid $934 to comprehensively insure their Mazda CX-30. Of course, everybody's situation is different, and your premium will vary according to the make and model of your car and other things insurers take into account, such as age, driving history, and where you garage the car. So let's get back into the CX-30 and talk about how the suspension is out on the road. And now we've got the sensible stuff out of the way, we can talk a little bit more about how the CX-30 drives out on the open road in terms of its chassis and its handling balance, because like most Mazda products today, the CX-30 is a really quite a lovely car to drive. It's got a really nice chassis balance, it's got pretty decent turn-in, and its road holding capabilities are good. You can sort of tip it in and feel it just turn around nicely, and you can adjust the poise of it with the throttle. It feels like a decent hatch, though it doesn't quite reach the lofty heights of the fantastic Mazda CX-3. So if you really like driving and you want a car you can sink your teeth into a little bit more, it's definitely worth considering this car's hatch counterpart, because it just feels a little bit lighter on its feet and a little bit crisper in its responses. But that's not to say the CX-30 isn't exactly safe out on the road. It feels really poised and balanced. It just doesn't reach quite the same heights as the hatchback, and that's kind of the story of all these small SUVs, because you're always going to sacrifice a little bit of handling prowess for, in theory, a little bit more comfort. And that brings me to this car's ride. So around town, the CX-30 is pretty good, but it does suffer a little bit of the same problem that the CX-3 does, that being that it is a bit harsher than some of its counterparts. These 16-inch alloy wheels do a really good job of adding a little bit of extra cushioning to the ride in the CX-30, but it still feels like you get some of that primary ride crashing through on sharper bumps. Now that all fades away with a bit of speed on the car. When you're out on a country road, in fact, it works in your favour, because the CX-30 actually stays really nicely controlled. It's very difficult to overwhelm the rebound damping. It feels well matched and pretty sorted on a country road, really. You can tell that Mazda's done pretty extensive testing to make sure the CX-30 always feels like it's in control and is relatively cosseting. Of course, again, I come back to the Mazda 3, which I think drives better in pretty much every respect. In lower grades, you do get even more suspension comfort somehow, despite in theory having a little bit less travel. The torsion bar rear suspension in this CX-30 is just a little bit more noticeable than in the Mazda 3. It thumps through a little bit into the cabin, and that kind of brings me on to NVH, which the CX-30 has much better engine insulation than the smaller CX-3. It's a quieter car under acceleration, and you get more of the pleasant soundtrack than in the CX-3 with less of the bad stuff. It sounds alright. Not terrible, but of course you don't buy a car like this for how it sounds. And on the freeway though, that means that when you can't hear the engine, you can hear a little bit more of the tyre roar. And although these Bridgestone Turanza T005 tyres don't have a huge amount of grip, they are also fairly loud on the freeway, and not so much on smooth roads, of course, because it's not such an issue, but on some of the roads we test these cars on that are really harsh coarse chip, it does get through into the cabin. So it's definitely worth taking the CX-30 out to somewhere with some coarse chip roads when you're test driving, just to make sure that you'll be okay with the noise, because it's not totally deal breaking, but again, it feels like it could be a little bit better suppressed. But what about safety in the CX-30? And that's where Mazda is doing a really good job at the moment in my book, because the CX-30 gets a whole bunch of really natty tech that is really good to have. So over the CX-3, you get adaptive cruise control as standard, though it doesn't have stop and go function unless you opt for the $1,500 safety pack. As standard, you also get rear cross traffic alert, rear parking sensors, and front and rear AEB, which is all really, really good stuff. You get lane departure warning as well, which works okay, if not as well as some other systems. Opting for that extra package that I mentioned before, $1,500, also nets stuff like lane keep assist and adaptive cruise with stop and go, and front parking sensors with front cross traffic alert. So a little bit of extra stuff for an extra $1,500, but I think I'd rather put the $1,500 from the safety kit towards going for the slightly more upmarket G20 Evolve, or perhaps even for the more powerful G25 powered Mazda CX-30s. But you can let me know what you do in the comment section down below. So what do we think of the Mazda CX-30 Pure? Well, in terms of purity terms, it's only about as pure as Nile water, really. But that doesn't mean it's a bad car per se. Of course, if this car had a leather steering wheel, I'd be pretty much saying go out and buy the CX-30 over everything else. But that plastic steering wheel makes it just a little bit unpleasant to live with every day. Everything else about it is pretty good, and it's got a really good amount of safety kit for the price. But you can let me know in the comment section down below what you'd do. Of course, I'd spend that extra $3,000 and opt for the Evolve, which has just a little bit more refinement and a little bit more kit standard. But again, let me know what you do, and while you're down there, we'd love it if you could hit subscribe and the bell icon. And as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.